Now, there is still significant demand for high-yielding debt across the world, and that high demand, particularly for African eurobonds, is spurring a wave of issuance across the continent. Benin, for example, saw its ratings outlook improve after successful eurobond issuances back in January. In February, Cote d'Ivoire went to the markets, raised over $1 billion in a eurobond sale that saw investors place orders for triple the amount on offer. And now Kenya is also planning to use the debt instrument to raise another $1 billion by June. Ghana and Nigeria also planning to prepare their own issues. According to Cote, an online economic affairs website, after a pandemic-induced lull in borrowing, governments and investors are feeling a bit more confident about the prospects of economies on the continent, in part thanks to billions of dollars worth of COVID-19 recovery help from the IMF and other multilateral lenders. African countries typically use eurobond funds to finance maturing debt obligations and relatively costly infrastructure projects. So let's explore the debt crisis that some countries on the continent are already dealing with at the moment. Professor Iraki is a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi, focusing on, among other things, managerial economics. He joins us now live on the program. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So let's start with a bit of comparative history, because the last time we had a major debt relief program, the highly indebted poverty reduction program, that was back in 1996. I wasn't even 10 back then. For a lot of audiences who are watching this might be history. So how does that program compare to the debt relief measures required today, like the G20 debt framework?
I think 25 years ago is quite some time ago, as you have observed. Because if you look at 1996, when this debt relief business started, a lot of African governments were not democratic. There were no regular polls. And it means that whatever the government did, the citizens did not know what was happening. The citizens were not exposed to a lot of transparency. They could not ask government questions. But fast forward to 2021 or 2020, a lot of governments now are democratic. Whatever they do, the citizens ask questions. Add internet and social media, and transparency becomes a very big issue in debt issues. Remember last week or last month or last week when the government of Kenya said that they are going to get some money from IMF, Kenyans were up in arms, even telling IMF not to give Kenya any debt. So things have changed. Media, more transparency, but today there is something you mentioned that is very important, COVID-19. COVID-19 has changed the debt, the mathematics of debt. But the two situations 25 years ago and today are very different.
But isn't part of the problem the fact that, at least at this point in time, you've got so many more different lenders on the table as well? Because in 1996, it was either you've borrowed bilaterally from the UK or the US or Germany or whoever, and the World Bank and the IMF. You could basically put all those guys in the same room. Now you have to add China, Saudi Arabia, Japan, commercial lenders who've essentially lent us money on eurobonds. So how then can we effectively give all of these individuals a sensible deal?
Some African leaders and some African politicians and policy makers are saying this is Africa's golden age when it comes to debt. You can play the lenders against one another. If the Westerners are not giving you money, you can go to Chinese. You can go to the lender who gives you the best deal. So as far as debt is concerned, we think it is a very good time. But the question is whether we are going to get the money we are going to get from the West or from China into the good use. Remember, that has always been the perennial question. You borrow money from the West, you borrow money from China, wherever you borrow it, do you put it into good use? I think that is a bigger question than where you get it from.
Let me loop back to something that you mentioned a little earlier, the problem of transparency, because in Kenya's case, as you mentioned, Kenyans were pretty pissed off at the fact that the government was going back to look for bailout from the IMF, $2.34 billion, agreed to over a 36-month program. But for typical Kenyan citizens, do they have legal options to force their government to be 100% transparent with all the debt they have on their books?
They have about three options. I don't think they have exploited them very well. One of them is, if you look at the 2010 Constitution, public participation is very well enshrined. But for any major decision to be implemented by the government, the citizens must always participate. And I've seen very major decisions in Kenya that were reversed in court because there was no evidence of public participation. The question is whether an ordinary Kenyan citizen knows how powerful he is in such issues. Number two, the Kenyans can go to court and challenge any government decision, including borrowing money. In fact, today there was a court case where a certain type of tax was overturned by the court, at least temporarily. And very important, Kenya's other powerful weapon is to vote out leaders that they don't consider to be transparent or to be contributing to the economic growth of the country. Those are the three options that Kenyans have.
You've also written about the dilemma facing authorities in countries like Kenya, because public spending is clearly not sustainable. We can't run deficits of 7, 8, 9% year after year after year. But the economic reforms that are needed to actually fix this problem are also by themselves rather painful. Tax hikes, spending cuts, or a mix of those two. They're not palatable either. But for the benefit of our viewers around the world, can you explain why in our particular context that cutting public spending is such a difficult thing?
In fact, one of the reasons why Kenyans were not very happy with the IMF is they could remember what happened some times ago when IMF gave us some loans. And they gave conditions that the government must retrench its employees. Some people had to lose jobs. So in this case, the reason why it is very hard to cut public spending is a very simple reason. Most of the money that the government collects as taxes goes to paying wages and salaries. So if you reduce public spending, you are saying that some people must lose their jobs. But remember that if people lose jobs, then the politicians or the political leaders lose votes. So there are a lot of vested interest in cutting public spending. You reduce it, people will be angry, people will be saying we are losing jobs, and you lose votes. Remember that in Kenya and other African countries, we don't have a very big private sector that can absorb a lot of employees. We don't have Googles, we don't have Apples, we don't have Walmarts. So the public sector becomes a very important employer. And anybody talking about reducing jobs in that sector is going to face a very serious political backlash.
But it is sort of inevitable at this point, though, that we will have to cut spending at some point, because if we can't keep spending $25 billion, yet our tax base is about 14 billion year after year after year.
And that's why people are seeing the IMF conditions as a tablet or as medicine. Medicine is very bitter, but you have to swallow it, or you have to swallow it if you have to get better. But I'm sure it's going to be a very big political debate when we try to implement IMF recommendations as far as that is concerned. But I think inevitably, we must face our moment of truth.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Professor Iraki from the University of Nairobi. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Much appreciated.